Hi everybody, I'm Walter and welcome back to the helicopter lesson in 15 minutes. So one of our favorite topics of course is the pitot system that in your face but not everybody quite understands, and it's so confusing, especially when the ports are blocked, this static port or the impact, the pitot tube system is blocked, the drainage is blocked. So let's dive into it and try to keep it as simple, straightforward, so we don't overcomplicate this. Again, it is true trial and error. By repeating this lesson a few times, that things will start making sense. But I want you to separate this from everything else. Right? The pitot system really only talks about 3 instruments. We're going to focus and zero in on that and try to keep it as simple as possible. Because that's how our brain, and especially some of our older people, older pilots, I'm not saying I'm old, but I'm older pilots. It takes a little bit of time for it to become sticky, right? So the pitot system is one of the gauges in the system. What we are talking about, the airspeed indicator. But interesting enough, it wasn't used in an aircraft until 1912. And mind you, that the first flight took place with the Wright brothers, of course, in 1903. Again, it goes back to feeling, right? Everything was done on feeling. Even today, as you go flying, you need to be able to feel the aircraft and sense the aircraft, right? From what is your attitude towards the horizon, which will allow you to see if you're flying straight and level, or if you're in a turn, a climb, or a descent. And all of these things are the informational pieces around the airspeed indicator, the altitude indicator, and the vertical speed indicator. These are instruments that help you sense things by visually displaying the results. But really you that need to learn in a visual environment, right? This is not valid when you're flying in the clouds, only when you have visual reference to the ground and to the horizon, that this is really more sensed by feeling, listening, and flying at the same time. So with that, let's dive into each of the systems itself. So let's do a quick overview. The 3 instruments we talked about are going to be the airspeed indicator, vertical speed indicator, and the altitude indicator. These are all pressure-sensitive instruments that determine by the airspeed, altitude, and the vertical speed. And it's an exchange of information really behind the gauges that is taking place that's causing small differentials in pressure. So where do we get the information from? Well, first, we have on the mast itself, where we have an intake, or like a pitot tube, and on the side of the aircraft where you have a static port. Of course, sometimes we have an alternate static port inside the aircraft itself, where there's one on each side. Again, if you're flying straight, the impact is straight in, and on the sides you get the best and most accurate information. If you go nose up, nose down, left or right, again, there's some minor errors that take place at that point in time. Again, all these things you have to kind of realize and understand that the information we are gathering, the impact pressure and the pressure differential depending on altitude changes, is translating into information that is on the gauges itself, right? So again, we're going to start off with first the vertical speed indicator itself. So how fast are we moving up? How many feet per minute are we climbing or descending, or are we staying level? Again, it's a straight level flight. That's one of the things you want to keep in your eye, right? You want to be even. You want to, at 0, and that's one in your pre-flight check. You want to see on the vertical speed indicator what it says. If it says 0, now for example, if it says plus 50, that's okay. Now I have to take that plus 50 into account whenever we are looking at when we're descending. Or when we are descending, or when we are ascending, when we're gaining altitude itself. So here the static port gives you a static air pressure that is expandable in the diaphragm, which connects to the instrument via mechanical linkage, which gives you the information up front. Now, as the pressure changes as you go and gain altitude or descend in altitude itself, it sends the information in the background. Now, once you reach that altitude, it goes back to 0, right? Because you're not climbing or descending anymore, because there's a small little leak that was created that allows the pressure to normalize to the next altitude that you have arrived at. It's as simple as that, and that's really the difference between an altitude indicator where there is no leak versus a vertical speed indicator, which has that leak, right? It normalizes to whatever altitude you end up at if you're descending or ascending itself. The altimeter has an aneroid waver that is connected to the instrument via mechanical linkage. Again, as the aneroid waver changes, it changes how we are going to be viewing. Are we, we're climbing, right? Well, climbing in the sense that you'll see the altitude needle moving, or it will give you, when you look at the result, we're flying at 6,500 feet, for example, on this little indicator below me. Again, there's one thing that we have to take into consideration is that we need to make sure that we are at the right pressure altitude to get the right reading. So on the right hand side of the gauge is called a Colesman window. In that Colesman window, we have to set the current pressure. So when you listen to the AWAS or the ADAS or the local airport, they always give you, or you speak to the TOWIE, they always give you a pressure reading like 29.902, right? Which is current sea level. Now, if sometimes it's higher, sometimes lower. It depends on different systems, high or low pressure systems, or systems that are in the area itself. Critically important because it needs to be equal to your elevation that you're at. So that's a good way to cross-reference, right? So if you're at an airport elevation of 400 feet, then when you adjust the Coleman window to the pressure setting that's given to you, that should equal, that should represent that you're at about 400 feet. Right? That could be one day at 2,992, it could be another day at 2,897, it could be another day at 3.007. Right? But the key is that when you look at, when you fix the position, where you know your elevation, it should equal that. That's a check mark to make sure that everything is functioning just right. So the pressure is compared to the pressure inside the casing itself, and moves the needle accordingly. So the pressure in the system itself is fixed, right? It comes from the outside. The waver again is closed, is locked, and it increases or decreases depending on the static pressure that is being sensed coming into the casing itself, where the aneroid waver is located. Now again, it would be a good idea too that if you have a mechanic who might have an instrument that's been cut open, to actually see this, right? Go to YouTube channel and look at it, just specifically lesson on the pitot instruments when the mechanics are taken apart. Sometimes that make that linkage. It makes it all make sense, right? This video is helpful to see and even touch things. The airspeed indicator, simply put, measures the dynamic pressure, right? The difference between the ram air pressure and the static air pressure. The ram air pressure, of course, comes from your pitot tube that's in the center mast above your head. So the ram air enters the diaphragm through the pitot tube, right? And there's a distance it has to travel. The static air enters through the static port, which is on the side of the aircraft itself. On the back side of the pitot tube, there is a drainage hole that allows any kind of water or sediments to exit the system, so it does not block the tube itself, because as soon as it's blocked or partially blocked, we will get a false reading on our airspeed indicator itself. So if there's no ram air pressure, the airspeed will be reading 0. Right? So if you are moving forward and you don't see any difference, then obviously you know that something is not right. In an airplane, for example, we have pitot heat, so we can actually, if there's maybe a blockage due to ice or maybe fluids, we can turn that on and it melts and evaporates. Of course, in a helicopter, we don't have that opportunity, right? So with higher ram air pressure, the diaphragm expands and the needle moves up. In other words, it's showing that we have airspeed. And again, we're going to talk about the different types of airspeed in a minute. And the airspeed will read higher than the ground speed at high altitude due to less dense air molecules. It sounds like we need to make a small adjustment, right, to what that is. And we're going to talk and break that apart in a second. But again, it's a very simple, straightforward instrument. It's the only instrument that uses both the ram and the static. Right? The vertical speed indicator, the altimeter, does not use ram pressure, for anything, right? So just keep that in mind. So the airspeed indicator, right? So a little bit more detail about that is that it provides the pilot with this speedometer type information. No different if you're driving a car, you want to see how fast you're going. And there are different, there's the arches in green. Well, it's actually white, red, green, and red. Did I get it right? Or maybe I screwed it up. It is green, red on the speedometer that you have to take a look at. In the airplane, you have white and red as well. In the helicopter, you actually don't have that. Each of those are ranges that you need to be able to work, operate in to stay within the operational limitations of the aircraft itself. And again, it's different for each aircraft, for the 22, the 44, the Camry, or whatever aircraft you're flying. But it also makes, what called the never exceed speed limit, the VNE, also can be needs to be adjusted to other factors, right? Environmental factors. And that's something you do in your pre-flight to see if there's anything that is. So on the chart you're looking at, when it comes down to temperature and pressure, then you can also see if you are falling in that curve. Most days you're not, especially if you're flying at the northeast. But certainly if you're flying in high altitude, 8, 9, 10,000 feet out west, this becomes more of a factor that you have to take into account, right? Because nothing good happens when you go too fast, right? It is something that we will talk about in other lessons in the future itself. So for example, for the 22, 60 knots KIS, right? It's indicated airspeed is normal takeoff and climb. 53 is a best rate of climb, 83 is max range, 65 is normal speed in auto rotation, 75 is a max glide in auto rotation. Again, if you look at the speed for a 44, all of them are slightly higher, right? Again, know your aircraft from the pilot operating handbook, just dive into it and you'll be able to see that. Now, I want to take a step back and to quickly look at the airspeed definitions, because that is something that is important and you need to take into consideration. And interesting enough, when you have digital instrumentation, like a G1000, this information is right in front of you. You will not have that per se when you have the what we call the steam gauges in your aircraft. So knots indicated airspeed is airspeed shown on the airspeed indicator as is, right? That's what you see. So the calibrated airspeed is corrected for instrument and position errors. The true airspeed is corrected for non-standard temperatures shown with the temperature boxes. And then the ground speed is the true airspeed corrected for the wind. Again, all of these things matter. Why? Because if you are flying long distance and you only have X amount of gallons of fuel in the tank, it becomes important. Right? It is how fast you go over the ground, how long it will take you to get from point A to point B. And every hour that you fly, for example, in a 44 would be like 15 gallons. Right? If you have a lot of headwind and it takes you longer, your ground speed is slower, it takes you longer to get there, but you will end up burning more fuel. So these things become important if you go on a trip. If you're just flying around the airport for half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour, it's less of an issue, of course. The vertical speed indicator tells us that, again, the climb and descent rate in feet per minute. Right? That's clearly indicated on that. It's controlled primarily through the collective input. Right? So as you increase or decrease, that you are going to be ascending or descending. Secondarily, of course, we can also pull the cyclic aft or forward slightly. That also we can dip the nose or pick up the nose. That can lead to increasing or decreasing our altitude itself. Again, the key here to remember is that the air pressure takes a second to equalize. So the information that you see there is lagging by about 7 to 9 seconds. Right? So that you just be mindful of that. So it's very, we don't want to chase this, right? We want to establish a climb until we get to where we want to be, and then we want to level off. And the level off is really looking outside the window, looking at the horizon, and see if your aircraft is flying at a straight and level. Of course, you'll see the VSI catching up with that within a few seconds thereafter. And then the altimeter, as the last piece, tells the pilot what altitude where we are in feet by comparing the set pressure, right, in the Colesman window, whatever we set for that particular day. And that is something we need to keep in mind, that as we increase altitude, right, the pressure outside changes by 1 inch per 1,000 feet. Now, one way of seeing it is when you start flying that, let's say you put your manifold pressure at 19 inches and you climb 1,000 feet, now it will reflect as 18 inches. Right? So it's a one way of keeping a close eye. And so when you're flying, especially if you're increasing altitude, you have to make minor adjustments in your pressure settings or the way you fly the aircraft itself. Right? Again, if we go all the way to 18,000 feet and above, we resume a standard number for anybody flying in level A, of course, which have to be IFR rated, and the helicopter will get nowhere near that anytime soon. Yeah, everybody goes back into the Kohl's-Mill window to 29 and 902. So everybody knows. Why is that important? Well, it is important when you start flying from a high pressure to low pressure area that you go from high to low, look out below. But we are not all using the same information in the geographical area that we are flying at. We might be flying into each other while we're thinking that we are flying, 250, 500 feet above or below. Not dissimilar to what the accident happened in Washington, D.C. between the Black Hawk helicopter and the commercial airplane, right? So that might be one of the NTSB investigations you want to keep an eye on or go check back into. So the Kohl's-Mill window has to be set to your local pressure at the field. Again, you want to look at it, but what you know is your elevation, and then make the adjustments to that as you fly away from the airport on regular basis, every 100 miles, or certainly every 30 to 45 to an hour. As you get updates, you want to make sure you make these changes so you stay on level ground with all of the other pilots flying around. All right, a couple of different altitude definitions, right? We have absolute altitude, which is the height of the aircraft above the terrain, right? It's AGL, right? Indicated altitude is reading on an altimeter for pilot set pressure setting, so whatever you set in the Kohl's-Mill window. The pressure altitude is the true altitude corrected for non-standard pressure, right? And again, the base is 29 and 92. The density altitude is the pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperatures. And the true altitude is the actual height above main sea level, which is one of the numbers that we use all of the time, of course, as we're flying. Again, this displays what I just talked about, right? From high to low, look out below. From low to high, clear the sky. Lock that into your brain because that is so critically important. Again, if you're flying local, it's not really all that relevant. But if you're flying longer distances, you might be crossing over in high to low pressure or low pressure to high pressure. This becomes critically important, especially if you're flying at night, and even more important if you're flying IFR in mountainous terrain, right? Again, that won't be you today, but it is something you need to take into account. The last chart here is something that I want you to sit down with your CFII and actually play this out, because there's a lot of information. This chart is always available. You'll be asked some questions about that. But what happens if either the REM pressure, right, the Pitot tube, or the static pressure port is closed? What will you be seeing? Well, the answer is simple, that if you have no REM pressure, it's blocked, then you should have a 0-speed indicator. But it's never that simple, right? So again, have a discussion, dive into it. I think it's way too confusing to talk about it by looking at the chart. This should be a lesson that you spend with your CFII. Again, looking at this in the aircraft and going over a couple different scenarios to try to make sense out of it. All right, good luck. I will see you at the next session. We're going to be talking about magnetic compass and errors and corrections that we need to make. All right, talk to you soon again. Thank you.